Hi, this is John Lee, and welcome to the second in our video series on implementing inquiry. In this video, we're going to be focused on staging the compelling question, a very important task in the inquiry process. We'll be kickstarting an inquiry and thinking about how to get things off on the right foot. In this session, we'll have three goals. Our first is to review the purposes of the staging task as a way to initiate an inquiry. Then we're going to look at different ways to construct the staging task within the IDM blueprint, really thinking about implementation and keeping students in mind. And then we're going to examine the instructional design and student learning outcomes of staging tasks. Along the way, we're going to have lots of examples, and we're going to be talking very explicitly about implementation, about what this looks like in the social studies classroom in Hawaii. All of this, of course, is inspired by and sort of in the context of the inquiry design model. And as you know, the inquiry design model is informed and inspired by the C3 framework. What we're trying to do is to put forward to teachers a way to design inquiry so that then in their classroom they can implement at a high level inquiry activity or inquiry lessons that will motivate students to learn about the subject matter in their classes. The design path for IDM lays out an approach to developing inquiries or designing inquiries, and then it also puts forward some very important ideas about implementation. Now, as you can see in this design path, when we're talking about crafting compelling questions, we're early on in the stage of designing an inquiry. We're also early on in the process of implementing the inquiry. And so that's kind of where our thinking should be right now as you are taking on the task of using inquiry in your classroom. So let's get started. This is the first part, focused on the purposes of the staging task as a way to initiate inquiry. So why stage? Why stage an inquiry? What's so important about setting this thing up? For one thing, staging helps us to get kids sort of into the inquiry. And as you can see here, I've suggested that it might involve raising students' level of concern. We don't want them to be worried. We don't want them to be anxious or upset. But there's something to be said for being in that condition where you're not quite sure. You're a little bit off balance. And that causes us as humans to want to get on balance, to want to learn something, to try to figure something out. And a good question can do that. A good compelling question should do that. The staging task helps us deliver on the compelling question in the early stages of the inquiry and helping kids to understand why they should be interested. Staging tasks are a hook, and a hook is a classical pedagogical strategy. It's really a general pedagogy, and we do that in a lot of our teaching. We have kids come into class and we try to get them interested and hook them into the stuff that we're going to do. But staging tasks can also, very importantly, activate prior knowledge. And we know from cognitive science it's very important to be active in the process of learning, but also to be active in the process of connecting new knowledge and what you're learning to existing knowledge. You can't do that if the prior knowledge hasn't been activated, if it's not there and ready to be connected to. Ultimately, a staging task is about getting kids thinking, getting them going, and starting off with a really active period of engagement for students that connects closely to what's going to come later in the inquiry. We think staging the compelling question should be a fairly precise task or exercise. We think something like 15 to 25 minutes, something that happens, of course, at the beginning of the inquiry, but also happens in a concise period of time. In many ways, this staging task is the first formative task. You all know about the overall structure of inquiry. You've already studied inquiry, and you understand that the inquiry design model puts forward an approach to inquiry that is made up of a series of tasks that students complete. In those tasks, as they engage them, the teacher is working alongside the students to provide them feedback, formative feedback about how they're doing. So in many ways, this is the first formative task. We don't call it formative, but I'm just saying that in practice, that's really how it works. You could make an argument that the staging task is the most important task because it's the establishing shot. You only get one chance to start something off. You only get one chance to begin an inquiry. And if we can hook students or get them in it, we'll have hopefully a better opportunity to keep them engaged in this and to keep them interested. So one way to do that is to focus on curiosity, to get kids interested so that they're like this child. You know, they just want to dig in and they're really focused and interested. But we know that this is what we want to avoid. So we want to, you know, ask ourselves, how do you make this kid, you know, is like, really, we got to do this? Why am I here? What is this for? To get that child to this, where they're really plugged in, they're turned on, they're fired up, and they're ready to do some inquiry. The reality is, oftentimes we have to manufacture curiosity. We want it to happen naturally, kind of like those images suggest, but that's our job as teachers, to try and put students in the position where they can do stuff that they might not otherwise have done. And so, you know, a staging task can do that. A staging can help us manufacture curiosity. And for a lot of us, and this is probably even true for kids, even though natural curiosity seems to come more readily to kids than adults, but for a lot of us, we need help to be curious. It just doesn't happen. We're busy, we're distracted, we're worried. But if we can get some help, and teachers are in the position to help, then oftentimes curiosity can actually be manufactured. But that's not it. We also need prior knowledge, as I said earlier. We need to get that prior knowledge moving so that kids are really thinking and ideas are popping in their heads. Students need to know something else. If an inquiry is about learning something, it doesn't begin with a blank slate. They don't have empty heads. They have, you know, minds that are full of all sorts of fascinating, interesting ideas, and we're trying to connect to those. And so we think that a staging task is also about manufacturing knowledge and starting that process where you already know something, and we're going to go through a staging task to remind ourselves of what we know, to activate the stuff that we know, and to get us moving along the path of learning some new things and developing new knowledge. Okay, so with that in place, let's shift gears now and think about the different ways that we can construct extensions within the IDM blueprint. Actually, that should say task. And of course, you know that tasks, as we've said, focus on curiosity and relevance, as well as prior knowledge and intellectual rigor. So I want you to keep those two things in mind. You might even want to jot them down right now. Curiosity and relevance, as well as prior knowledge and intellectual rigor. Okay, so keep those in mind. We're going to go through some examples. And in these examples, what I want to do is to reveal the design thinking that went into these and to talk about the implications of implementation and what it looks like in the classroom. Okay, so here's the first one, the first example. This example is a kindergarten inquiry. It was developed in the state of New York and it's available to everyone on C3 Teachers. This particular inquiry asked the question, is everyone unique? And as a staging exercise, the idea here is that teachers would engage students in a discussion of the question, who am I? Now, that particular question, who am I, is designed to help kids get curious. It's designed to help kids make connections, to think about relevance, to hit on that portion or that idea of a compelling question where it's relevant for kids. We're asking kids who they are, so of course they're able to make the connection to themselves. Who am I? And we think, and we've seen actually in the classroom, that this works really well. It's an interesting question actually if you pose it to yourself and think about it right now. Who am I? Like, how do you answer that question? Who am I? Well, I'm a professor, I'm a father, and then you go down the list and say all these things, and you start to say things that are probably more revealing. And that we think not only makes the relevance and the kind of the curiosity going, but it's really going to set the stage for a good inquiry and for kids to really be plugged in and turned on to what they're doing. The second example is about Japanese American internment. And in this question, compelling question, we asked, should freedom be sacrificed in the name of national security? That's kind of a classic topic to study in history, particularly in U.S. history. The staging asks students to consider the limits of personal freedom by taking a position on a series of current issues through a four corners activity. So this is a fairly precise exercise. The way it works in the classroom is students go to the corners of the room after an issue has been presented, and each corner represents a position on the issue. Folks start sharing, and then they move physically based on the conversations that are had, and maybe shifts in the ways that kids feel about this dynamic between personal freedom, basically the limits of personal freedom. How far are we willing to go in sacrificing or limiting our personal freedom for the purposes of something else, in this case, national security? The current issue is very important, so getting that in place ahead of time, something that kids may know a little bit about, is very important. We've also seen some teachers who have taken this four corners activity and just turned it into a continuum and had kids line up, and they'll toss out a topic and say something like we're dealing with now related to, let's say, the NSA, National Security Administration, eavesdropping on telephone calls. Might not be as relevant today as it was, but any sort of collection of information that might be considered to be an invasion of personal freedom. If you balance that against the need to collect information to try and thwart a potential terrorist attack, ask kids, well, where do you fall? Are you willing to let people listen a little bit, a lot of it, not at all? And then line up. Either go to corners of the room or line up. Then have some conversation, tell people to move if their thinking is shifting. And so what this is doing is really hitting on the second idea. The second idea is about prior knowledge and intellectual rigor. Because in order to do this, kids are really going to have to think about what they already know. What do they know about these issues? What do they know about this concept of personal freedom? So in these two examples, the example about being unique and who am I, that one's really focused on the personal and the curiosity. And the second one, we think, is a little bit more focused on the prior knowledge and the intellectual rigor. But it could be that they both do a little bit of each. Now, these are some staging tasks that are in inquiries that are published on C3 Teachers. I'm sharing these with you just so that you can see some examples of them. This PowerPoint, of course, is available in the Dropbox. You just click on the link and you can pull it down and look at it. You can also, of course, go on C3 Teachers and get any of these and look at them. They are arranged by grade band, so elementary is in the first column, middle in the second column, and secondary high school in the third column. We're actually going to use a few of these as examples in just a minute, but I just wanted to give you a variety of the kind of staging possibilities that exist, from the one I just showed about engaging the class discussion on who I am, to all the way over to the high school side, to the secondary side, watch a brief documentary on the dedication of the National World War II Memorial and discuss how the war affected veterans' families. So again, we'll look at a few more of these in just a minute. I want to go back, though, for just a second to the two that we looked at already, and just reiterate the way that the staging works. And I want to use the blueprint to do this, but really to talk about it in the classroom. This staging, engaging in that question of who am I, it's really pointed very directly to the compelling question. In some ways, it's kind of a different way of saying the compelling question. It also pushes down into the supporting question. You can see supporting question number one, am I unique? So it has this really nice position in between the compelling question and the first supporting question. So functionally, as a teacher, as you're thinking about this thing play out, you have to kind of use these questions strategically as you move kids through the inquiry. The second example that I gave you, or actually this is a third example, I'm sorry, is anything new about today's immigration policy debate. In this example, the staging task is a little bit different. Examine political cartoons that address the current debate about immigration policy. It doesn't really connect explicitly back to the compelling question in terms of its structure, like this one did. Instead, it points down, in some ways, to sources, because kids are going to work with political cartoons later. And so we're going to talk more about this in a minute, but the staging can do a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be really explicitly connected to the compelling question. It should stage the compelling question, the topic of the inquiry, but it can do some other things. It can help in sort of setting the stage for working with sources. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into that area and examining the instructional design and student learning outcomes of the staging task. And we'll look again at some more examples here. Okay, and we're really going to be thinking about this question: how do I use a staging task in my classroom? And that's what it's ultimately about. How do you get these kids set up for an inquiry, ready for an inquiry, activated, and prime the pump? Now, Madeline Hunter has had a lot to say about this. As you all may know, Madeline Hunter is an educational theorist and curriculum designer, and she, along with many others, have talked about the importance of staging and getting kids activated. She would use the term activating prior knowledge and anticipatory sets, and getting kids to anticipate the things that are coming next. And this is a quote from Madeline Hunter: "If you are satisfied with your appearance, job, or where you live, you will not put forth effort to change it. It's only when you become concerned that you will do something." So the idea here is that, and we know this, and I talked about it at the very beginning of this video, we got to get kids off balance just a little bit. We got to get them sort of moving around and not comfortable, so that they're concerned, I'm doing air quotes, concerned enough to want to engage in this inquiry. They want to move forward. They want to push through it. It's going to be hard work oftentimes doing inquiries, and this is the kind of thing that we want to do to set them up for that work. Okay, so let's look at some of those implementation aspects. I'm going to go through these four questions with y'all. How can a staging facilitate the compelling question? How can it set up supporting questions? How can it initiate tasks? And how can it feature sources? So as I said a minute ago, staging in implementation, a staging task can do a lot of things. And I want to show you the range of things that you can do in your classroom with staging tasks. Here's the first one. How does the staging task facilitate the compelling question? Here's an example of an inquiry, 5th grade-ish. You know, this is going to work different in different places, but the sources are designed so that it could probably be used in upper elementary grade. The question asks, compelling question asks, what makes a complex society complex? I'm giving you this example because I think this staging really hits the compelling question. It really does unpack the compelling question. The staging is for teachers to help students or facilitate students as they discuss examples of complexity in our society today, noting things that have changed recently in society and how those things are connected, for example, cell phones and the internet. So as you can see, there's a real explicit connection. The question's about complexity, the staging focuses on complexity. In the inquiry, students are going to be looking at the complexity in ancient civilizations, so we begin by having them look at complexity in society today. It activates knowledge, sets up that anticipation on the part of students, and activates their prior knowledge. So that's one that connects directly to this compelling question. Here's another example. This one, I think, is good in how it facilitates supporting questions. The question asks, how did sugar feed slavery? And it's about sugar plantations in North America, and specifically the Caribbean. And so the staging task says, complete a think, pair, share activity to determine if any popular consumer products today might be produced through inhumane means. And if you look at the way this works, the supporting questions they're doing a lot of things here in the supporting questions, but there's a nice connection between the staging and the supporting questions. The Think, Pair, Share is focused on popular consumer products today, and students are working on a consumer product with supporting question 1. Okay, so they're hitting on kind of this thinking about consumer products, and they're going to be able to, we think, kind of more focused on the anticipatory set, move forward with the supporting questions here. Here's another one. This particular compelling question asks, did the Constitution establish a just government? And we think this staging question sets up the task. The staging asks, or teachers would in the staging, read the preamble of the Constitution and discuss with students how a government can achieve the goals in the preamble. So what's happening here is the students are starting to read the Constitution, and as you can see in these tasks, they're going to be working with the Constitution. So it sets them up to start to do some stuff with the Constitution. And in many ways, it's really like a pre-formative task, or even a proto, maybe even a first formative task. And that's just how the inquiry writers here wanted to do this. So if I'm teaching this particular inquiry, I'm really thinking about the staging task that way. And here's one more example. And this one is about how the staging can help feature sources. So in this one, students are working with a source to question, why should I be a global citizen? So it's an elementary, early childhood inquiry. And students would watch a video on changing the world and brainstorming what it means to be a citizen. And so you'll see in the sources for the formative task, there's a lot of images. There isn't a video, but there's a lot of images. So students are starting the work of thinking visually and working with sources in this staging. So, that's an overview of the staging task and how to implement those in the classroom. The takeaway I hope for y'all is that staging in the hands of a teacher when implementing an inquiry can do a lot of different things, and it's super important for you to think about those things that can happen. The staging tasks are written in such a way that there's an expectation that they might be, doing something like explicitly helping kids think about the compelling question, or starting to set up the supporting questions, the formative task, or working with sources. But you all, as good teachers, are going to make adjustments and do the things that you think are best in your classroom, and we want to encourage you to do that. So when you write your own inquiries, you go to C3 teachers and you get the inquiries off of C3 teachers, and you start to implement. Make sure that you're thinking carefully about what your goals are in the staging task. How much do you want to activate knowledge? How much do you need to pique that curiosity? How much do you need to focus on the relevance? How much on the rigor? And then how are you going to do that? So we'll look forward to talking with y'all more about that and supporting you in the process. Of course, you'll go on your hub, this is the Hawaii C3 hub, and learn more about how you can do that. Thank you very much. I'll look forward to talking with y'all more about staging the compelling question.